Right now, as you're watching this, a container ship bearing French ownership markings is moving through the Strait of Hormuz. It is the first Western European vessel to pass through that choke point since February 28th, the night the United States launched Operation Epic Fury and effectively sealed off 1/5 of the world's oil supply. That ship did not get through because of Donald Trump. It got through because France cut a deal with Iran. And the moment that vessel cleared the strait, the entire geopolitical architecture of this war shifted permanently. Here is the thesis. Here is the single line that every editor in Washington is too scared to print. The world has not just grown frustrated with Donald Trump. The world has made a strategic decision to route around him. They are not waiting for American leadership. They are not asking permission. Country by country, continent by continent, they are building the diplomatic infrastructure for a post-American world order. And they are doing it right now, in real time, while Trump posts on Truth Social about taking oil and NATO being useless. This is not a future scenario. This is what is happening today. And the reason this matters to you is not abstract. The reason this matters is $4.02 per gallon at the pump, a nationwide average that crossed that threshold this week for the first time since 2022. The reason this matters is that Dubai crude hit $166 per barrel on March 19th, a record. It has settled around $114 a barrel since. The reason this matters is that fertilizer prices are spiking because 30% of internationally traded fertilizer normally transits the Strait of Hormuz. Your grocery bill is not a political talking point. It is the direct consequence of a war launched without a plan, without allies, and without an exit strategy. The world is no longer waiting to find out what that exit strategy is. They have moved on. And that is the story nobody in American mainstream media is telling you right now. We know this because the evidence is layered, verifiable, and coming from multiple independent sources across 3 continents. The timeline alone tells you everything. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear infrastructure, and senior leadership, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who was killed in those initial strikes. No allied government was consulted beforehand. Not France, not Germany, not Japan, not the United Kingdom. Not a single NATO partner received a phone call before the bombs dropped. 2 days later, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps sealed the Strait of Hormuz and issued a warning so explicit it left no room for interpretation. Any vessel attempting to pass would be set ablaze. Within a week, oil prices jumped over 40%. By March 10th, Iran had carried out 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships. War risk shipping insurance premiums had tripled overnight. Qatar Energy, the world's largest LNG producer, slashed export capacity by 17% and warned it might invoke force majeure on long-term contracts for up to 5 years. By March 19th, Dubai crude reached that record $166. The International Energy Agency's chief, Fatih Birol, called it a worse shock to global energy markets than the 2 oil crises of the 1970s combined, and worse for gas markets than the Russia-Ukraine war. The entire global supply chain was being repriced in real time. And where was the American plan? There wasn't one. Here is what that sequence tells you. Trump started a war that immediately and predictably closed the world's most critical shipping lane, made no contingency arrangements for that outcome, and then turned to the same allies he had spent 3 years humiliating and demanded they fix it for him. Picture the room in Paris on the night of March 2nd, the Élysée Palace. Emmanuel Macron receives the first full intelligence briefing on what the strike package actually destroyed and what it didn't. The nuclear sites, the missile depots, the leadership compounds, and the one thing they missed, the one variable that no war simulation apparently stress tested, that Iran did not need a nuclear weapon to bring the global economy to its knees. It needed 21 IRGC speedboats and control of a 21-mile-wide channel. The French president looks at that briefing. He looks at the oil price. He looks at the fact that his country was not consulted, not warned, not given even the diplomatic courtesy of a heads up before a war that would immediately start strangling French energy supply. And in that moment, something shifts. Not anger exactly, something colder than anger, calculation. Because Macron is not a man who operates from emotion. He operates from doctrine. And the doctrine he arrives at, the one he starts quietly building toward in those first 2 weeks of March, is this: the moment America chose to act unilaterally is the moment America forfeited its claim to lead the response. If you don't consult us before starting it, you don't get to command us to finish it. That is not disrespect. That is the basic logic of sovereign nations. What Macron says publicly in Seoul a few weeks later is the elegant version of what he concludes in that briefing room in Paris. He tells students at Yonsei University, "We must not be passive in this new disorder." He says, "There is room to build new cooperation between France, South Korea, and other partners, Canada, Japan, India, Brazil, Australia, to forge what he explicitly calls a third way." He says, and these are his precise words, "Our objective is not to be vassals of two dominant powers. We don't want to depend on Chinese dominance, and we don't want to be too exposed to the unpredictability of the United States." Notice the language. He doesn't say American aggression. He doesn't say American imperialism. He says unpredictability. That is the diplomatic word for a leader who wakes up one morning and starts a war without telling you. That one word is the quiet verdict of the entire Western alliance. Receipt number 1, the French container ship. A vessel signaling French ownership exits the Strait of Hormuz. According to Bloomberg, it is the first confirmed Western European transit since the war closed the waterway. This did not happen by accident. The day before that ship sailed, France, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, blocked a resolution that would have authorized military force to reopen the strait. France voted no. China voted no. Russia voted no. The resolution was dead before it hit the floor. And the very next day, Iran waved a French ship through. You do not have to believe in coincidence to understand what happened there. Iran was sending a message as loud and clear as any press release. Countries that refuse to authorize force against us will receive passage. Countries that side with Trump's war get nothing. That is not chaos. That is a foreign policy, a sophisticated, deliberate, targeted one. And France read it perfectly and responded in kind. The verdict: France has effectively entered a bilateral understanding with Iran, and it did so openly, visibly, with full awareness that Trump would see it, because the point was for Trump to see it. But that's only part of it. Receipt number 2, Japan, the world's fourth largest economy and the fifth biggest oil importer, with 95% of its oil coming from the Middle East and 70% of that passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Japan does not have the luxury of principled abstention. Japan needs that strait open the way you need air. And so Japan moved. A liquefied natural gas tanker operated by Mitsui O.S.K. Lines, one of Japan's most prominent shipping companies, crossed the Strait of Hormuz. It was confirmed publicly. No apology, no explanation. Just a ship that moved through water that America said it was controlling. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was explicit about the underlying dynamic. He told Kyodo News, "We have not closed the strait, it is open." And then he said something that should be printed in every newspaper in America, but won't be. Iran was prepared to ensure safe passage for Japan. Let that land. Iran is offering Japan a bilateral guarantee of shipping safety. Not Trump, Iran. The country Trump has been bombing for 5 weeks is now offering Japan a more reliable energy security guarantee than the United States military can provide. The verdict: Iran is functioning as a selective toll authority and strategic dealmaker, and Japan is dealing with the actual power in the room rather than the theoretical one. Here's where it gets worse. Receipt number 3, the Gulf Cooperation Council. These are the Gulf monarchies: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman. These are the countries that were supposedly under the American security umbrella. The countries that had been, according to leaked reporting and public financial disclosures, funneling extraordinary sums into Trump-adjacent financial vehicles. Cryptocurrency payments, real estate ventures, contributions to Jared Kushner's private equity fund. These were the payers of the pay-for-play security arrangement. And now even they are pulling back. The GCC Secretary General issued a statement this week with language that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. The Council desires to establish normal relations with Iran and said Gulf countries would take all measures to protect their sovereignty. Read that in translation. The Gulf states are no longer confident that the United States security guarantee is worth what they paid for it, and they are beginning to explore their own accommodation with Iran. The countries that funded Trump's orbit are now quietly signaling to Tehran that bilateral negotiations are on the table. The verdict: when your most loyal regional clients start hedging toward your adversary, you have not just lost the argument, you have lost the region. Receipt number 4, the Philippines. This one flies completely under the radar of American media, and that is exactly why it matters. The Philippine foreign minister posted publicly about a productive call with Iran's foreign minister, Araghchi, describing what they reached as a positive understanding on the safety of our seafarers and the security of our energy supply. The phrase used was warm spirit of cooperation. Warm spirit of cooperation with Iran, a country the United States is actively bombing, a country Donald Trump has threatened to obliterate. The Philippines is not a rogue state. It is a treaty ally of the United States, and it is negotiating directly with Iran for energy security guarantees. Contrast that language, warm, cooperative, constructive, with the language coming from the White House this same week. Trump posts on Truth Social about wanting to take the oil and make a fortune. He tells allies to build up some delayed courage and just take it. He mocks Macron's wife in a public statement. He tells the UK, Germany, Japan, and every other country struggling with fuel shortages that they should learn how to fight for yourselves. The verdict: the diplomatic contest between Washington and Tehran for influence over the global South is not even close right now, and Iran is winning it without firing a single missile at anyone who didn't start this war. Here is what every other outlet is missing. The story isn't that individual countries are cutting side deals with Iran. That is the surface. The story underneath is that a structured, coordinated, multilateral diplomatic architecture is being assembled right now to manage the post-American Middle East. And it is being assembled not in secret, but in plain sight, at the invitation of the United Kingdom. On April 2nd, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer convened a virtual meeting of 41 countries, spanning Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Canada, and Australia, to discuss diplomatic and political measures to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The meeting was framed publicly as addressing the crisis, but the unspoken logic of the meeting, which analysts quoted by The Hill were explicit about, was this: these countries are developing a shared framework for negotiating with Iran for when Trump walks away. Not if, when. Let me translate that for you. What the UK meeting was actually doing is this: when the United States eventually disengages from this war, whether in 2 weeks or 2 months, Iran will hold the cards. Iran will be the entity that controls passage through the strait. And if 41 countries walk into those negotiations with no coordination and no shared terms, Iran plays them off against each other and extracts maximum concessions from everyone. But if those 41 countries walk in with an agreed framework, with shared red lines, shared offer structures, shared leverage, then Iran faces a coalition, not a queue of supplicants. Britain is not organizing this meeting to help Trump. Britain is organizing this meeting to prepare for the world after Trump fails. And the fact that 41 countries showed up tells you exactly what the global consensus is about what happens next. So ask yourself this: if the entire international community is already building the infrastructure for a post-American settlement with Iran, what does that say about where they think this war is going? To understand why Trump ended up here, isolated, ignored, shouting into a social media feed while the world quietly rewires itself around him, you have to understand the playbook he was operating from, and more importantly, where that playbook broke. Trump's operating doctrine in international affairs has always been coercive bilateralism. You apply maximum pressure on a single target. You threaten consequences serious enough that the target capitulates before you have to follow through. You take a win. You move on. It worked, or appeared to work, in the first term, with North Korea, with the renegotiation of trade deals, with some NATO spending pledges. The core assumption of the playbook is that the other side's fear of your power is greater than their capacity to absorb punishment. That assumption does not hold against Iran in 2026. And here is the precise place it breaks. Iran, after 40 years of sanctions, after surviving the 12-day war with Israel in June 2025, after watching the United States violate 2 separate negotiated frameworks in Geneva, has made a strategic calculation. The cost of capitulating to Trump is higher than the cost of being bombed by Trump, because capitulating creates a permanent precedent of American leverage. Being bombed, surviving being bombed, creates the opposite precedent. It demonstrates that Iranian resistance can impose global economic costs too severe for the rest of the world to absorb indefinitely. And that demonstration is exactly what is happening right now. Notice what Iran didn't do. It did not launch a massive conventional counteroffensive against U.S. military positions. It did not attempt to close the entire Persian Gulf. It did not strike at the continental United States. What it did was surgically, precisely, methodically demonstrate that it can hold the global economy hostage through a 21-mile strait and force every country on earth to choose between America and their own energy supply. That is not desperation. That is strategy. And the strategy is working. The historical analogy here is not Iraq or Afghanistan, though Macron invoked both. The closer parallel is Vietnam, not the military dimension, but the diplomatic one. The moment the international community determined that American military escalation was not producing resolution, they stopped waiting for American leadership and started building parallel structures. OPEC, the non-aligned movement, détente through back channels. The formal architecture of American hegemony remained intact long after the actual hegemony had been hollowed out. That hollowing is what you are watching now. Call it the Hormuz Doctrine. Any nation powerful enough to impose global economic pain through geography cannot be permanently isolated by a single superpower's sanctions architecture. The world will route around the isolation before it routes around the pain. The doctrine Trump's team doesn't want you applying to this situation. The Carter Doctrine of 1980 pledged American intervention to protect its interests in the Middle East. The Reagan corollary extended that to internal stability in the Gulf states. Those doctrines assumed American credibility and alliance cohesion. Both are now operationally absent. Macron's Third Way coalition is not an alternative to those doctrines. It is their replacement. Three expert voices that you need to hear together, because when they converge, the picture is undeniable. Fatih Birol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. The crisis has had a worse impact on oil than the two shocks of the 1970s combined. That is the IEA director. That is the institution created after the 1973 oil embargo to prevent exactly this scenario. He is saying this surpasses that. Let that register. Diane Swank, chief economist at KPMG, told CBS News, all the cost shifts from this crisis are adding to costs, a portion of which will be passed along to consumers. The costs that are not passed along show up as a squeeze in profit margins and employment. Translation: your gas prices are the visible part. The invisible part is layoffs, margin compression, and a recession cycle that doesn't announce itself until it has already arrived. A senior energy market analyst quoted by Fortune put it in terms that no White House communications team can spin away. I don't think it's a durable scenario where we just sort of leave and say, hey, cut your deals with Iran. They're the toll keeper now. Good luck. The geopolitical precedent this creates effectively cancels the Reagan corollary and the Carter Doctrine simultaneously. 46 years of American strategic commitment to Persian Gulf security, erased by a 5-week war launched without a plan to win it. And when the head of the IEA, a Wall Street chief economist, and a geopolitical energy analyst all point at the same structural failure, you pay attention. To be fair, there is a legitimate counter-argument, and it deserves a serious hearing. The case for Trump's approach is this: Iran's nuclear program was the existential threat. No negotiated framework had successfully constrained it. Not the JCPOA, not the Geneva talks, not the 2025 interim agreement that the U.S. walked away from. Military action, however chaotic, may have done more to set back Iranian nuclear capability than decades of diplomacy. The Strait of Hormuz crisis, on this view, is painful but temporary. Iran cannot sustain an economic blockade of the global oil supply indefinitely. Pressure will eventually produce a settlement, and a settlement that comes from a position of Iranian military defeat is structurally stronger than one negotiated from Iranian strength. There is also an argument that Macron's third way coalition, however rhetorically appealing, is substantively hollow. Medium powers, France, South Korea, Brazil, cannot project force into the Gulf. They cannot enforce any agreement they negotiate. Their leverage over Iran is ultimately derivative of American hard power. Remove that backstop, and the diplomatic architecture they are building has no enforcement mechanism. Those are real arguments, and they would be compelling, except for two structural facts. First, Iran has not capitulated. It is now day 35 of this war. The United States military has struck over 9,000 Iranian targets and flown over 9,000 combat missions. The strait is still effectively closed to most traffic, and Iran's foreign minister is still publicly offering bilateral passage guarantees to Japan and the Philippines. The military campaign has not produced the political outcome it was supposed to produce. Second, the internal White House briefings, as reported by CNN, now acknowledge that the administration cannot guarantee to reopen the strait within its own self-imposed 4 to 6 week timeline. The exit strategy has collapsed on its own terms, according to Trump's own advisors. Process matters. Evidence matters. What the record shows is not a president who made a difficult but strategically sound decision. It is a president whose decision has produced outcomes that even his own team can no longer defend on the timeline they promised. Here is what this means for your life in the next 30 to 90 days. Gas is at $4.02 per gallon nationally right now. In California, it has already crossed $5. If the strait remains at current traffic levels, only about 5% of normal throughput, oil analysts estimate that prices will stay elevated well above $100 per barrel. That means the average American household pays somewhere between $300 and $500 additional dollars over the spring and summer months just in fuel costs. It also means every physical good that travels in a truck or a ship costs more. That is food, that is medication, that is the components in every manufactured product you buy. Fertilizer prices are the sleeper variable in this equation. 30% of globally traded fertilizer moves through the Strait of Hormuz. When fertilizer prices spike, food prices follow with a 3 to 6 month lag. The spike is already in. The food price transmission has not yet fully arrived at the supermarket shelf. It is coming, and it will arrive precisely as the midterm election cycle heats up, which is why CNN is reporting that Republican strategists inside the White House view this as their single largest political liability heading into November.